disorders in the United States. I chose this particular item on the dailies, a disability affected life year metric from the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation, because it does play. It's not the most significant metric for our country, but it is a very significant factor in my personal job as a paramedic and for public health in general for the United States, more so than any other nation, almost 3 times as much as the next highest nation as far as drug overdoses goes. For comparison, in the U.S., the dailies had us listed at 5.52% of disability affected life years for 2019, whereas Germany, 0.72% of disability affected life years. The reason I chose Germany is I'm going to get into the immigration crisis that we have currently at the southern border, which is where a lot of fentanyl and other illicit narcotics are coming in. We are far from being the only nation to have issues with immigration. So that was kind of to highlight the disparities in that particular statistic that may look similar elsewhere. In 2019, we had 21.6 deaths per 100,000 population. However, from 2019 to 2020, that number jumped up 31%. Some of the risk factors for drug abuse disorders are family history. If you have a family history of addiction, you can be genetically predisposed for addiction. I hear this quite often in alcoholics, addicts that we pick up. Family members of mine, I've always been warned to stay away from substances like that because of so much of my own family history, so I know that to be true. People with mental health disorders such as depression, ADHD, PTSD specifically, and a number of other mental illnesses are more likely to fall prey to drug use disorder. Sometimes it's simply that addictive personality, that predisposition, and it can also be used to cope as a coping mechanism for a number of illnesses. Sometimes medication or treatment, or even being seen by a physician is too expensive or too inconvenient for somebody that lives far away from medical treatment, and that can lead to addiction as well. For peer pressure, the environment created by one's peers has a major social effect on a person's habits and behavior, which is why your mother always tells you she doesn't want you hanging out with them kids down the street. It's as simple as that. Humans are social creatures, so if there's an environment that has already been created, you tend to conform to that environment when you're in there. So if people have a peer group of church-attending, God-fearing, friendly, average kids, they're far less likely to fall into drug use and addiction. Another major risk factor is early use. When a person's brain is still developing, there are certain physiological and physical changes that can occur within the brain that can increase their likelihood of addiction, specifically to that medication, but also from the after effects of that medication, aka the dopamine rush, or the dopamine release, serotonin, what have you. You can be more likely to seek that out in the future. All right, so the United States has the highest recorded rates of overdose in the world. It can easily be argued that our culture plays a major role in this statistic with societal acceptance. A major role in this societal acceptance of drug use creating a demand and the lack of border and drug law enforcement that are currently on the books, that's failing to hamper the supply. Many public health professionals today argue that we need to further reduce the stigma of drug abuse and focus on emergency treatment and methadone and buprenorphine availability. Now, I personally think that is the exact opposite of what needs to happen to really make a meaningful change and to create true health behavior changes as a society in our country. Reducing the stigma, opposite. That is the worst thing that could happen when we create a society where these things are acceptable and abusers are not outcast. That simply creates a welcoming environment for the behavior that you do not want. As far as methadone and buprenorphine clinics and availability goes, absolutely. anything that can help wean somebody off and get them to a healthy psychological, social, and spiritual place, that is fantastic. We do need to maintain emergency treatment, such as naloxone. I know for a while there was talk of medication, carrying medications and making that over the counter to counteract barbiturates or benzodiazepines, Romazicon being the emergency treatment for benzodiazepine. And although we do have a large availability for that, we haven't seen the numbers go down. In fact, the numbers have gone up. And there are some other issues with that, such as affecting the availability of accurate data for the number of overdoses that are secondary to that, and we'll get into that here in just a little bit. Gaps and limitations. The data collected by the IHME comes from the CDC. Most of the CDC information comes from the DOSE system. It's the Drug Overdose Surveillance and Epidemiology System, and it utilizes ED and inpatient hospitalization discharge data to collect reported data to the CDC. Now, there is no mandatory reporting in most jurisdictions, so this information comes from, specifically, this information comes from patients that have survived a discharge, and they would have had to have admitted to or had significant evidence that they were being treated for an overdose for that to be collected. Now, that being said, in-hospital deaths are not accurately attributed to drug overdose without an autopsy, and very infrequently are autopsies actually performed. A good metric or a good way to collect data that we do not do is data from EMS systems. The CDC does not collect and utilize overdose data from EMS providers nationwide, and part of the reason for that is, again, we don't have mandatory reporting when it comes to EMS, and there's no national standard charting software. There are at least a dozen different popular charting softwares throughout the country for EMTs and paramedics. We've got EMS charts, we've got Zoll, a number of them. ESO is my personal favorite. All of them make it possible to search and collect data from calls, but due to HIPAA regulations, it's very difficult to get information on a large scale, and only a few providers within a certain organization are even able to collect data organization wide. Typically, you can only access charts from patient encounters that you were personally on, unless you have special administrative privileges within that organization. Now, back to the topic of Narcan. Recently, Narcan has become over the counter for a lot of places, a lot of jurisdictions. New York City began offering it in vending machines, which is great. It often it saves a lot of lives. It certainly does. However, it is very frequent that if somebody is given Narcan at home, they will either not call 911 or will not go to the hospital. And the same thing happens when given Narcan by EMS, Narcan being naloxone. If they wake up and they're alert and oriented and they refuse to go to the hospital and be treated, then we can't force them to go. And then that data is not collected. So there's no current effort to track recipients of over-the-counter Narcan or even prescription Narcan, or to track its administration by bystanders, which again, of course, obscures the true overdose numbers. All right, so there are many ways really to mitigate this current crisis. With reference to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Goal number 1 there is no poverty. Now, poverty is, of course, a significant risk factor for drug use, experimentation, overdose, mainly for depression. It's one of the strongest links for depression is financial hardship, and depression is in turn another significant risk factor for drug abuse, which we discussed before. Good health and well-being, that's more than simply physical health. Educating people on ideal physical health and the necessity for it, that is, of course, going to lead to reduced instances of drug use. But well-being refers to more than simply physical health. You've got social health, you've got your spiritual health, and when people tend to be more active members of a community, of a church group, of a large, tight-knit family, then they're less likely to fall into certain vices. Goal number 4 there, quality education. I think a lot of the reason young people especially experiment is they simply don't believe anything that's coming out of teachers' mouths. They don't have a lot of health curriculums in schools have kind of moved away from the strong anti-drug scare programs, and since that's happened, we've of course seen a rise in youth drug use. Decent work and economic growth, goal number 8 there. That is again a risk factor because it is again a risk factor for poverty, depression, when people feel trapped and there's no chance for advancement, there's no chance to improve your standing status in life. That can lead to significant depression. Border enforcement. Almost all of the fentanyl in the United States is coming from the southern border. It's brought in on foot, by vehicles, sometimes by plane. The cartels that are aiding in the illegal immigrants that are coming across the border, they have complete control of the border from the south. So everybody that is able to get over here on foot has made their way through the cartels, and they have to pay for it. One of the ways they can pay is by carrying sometimes hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars of illicit narcotics on their back over into the United States. We have the capability to significantly reduce that, but for political reasons, we seem to not want to do that. And political reasons being the same reason we simply don't enforce existing drug laws. It's seen as cruel or inhumane to put somebody in prison for drug use, which is a solid argument. However, ordering somebody to attend outpatient or basically voluntary rehabilitation or therapy, it's simply not doing anything. It's not having any effect on drug use reduction. It doesn't work. What we do need to do is enforce the drug laws that we do have and stop ignoring them. I'm sure we've all seen images and videos of San Francisco, Seattle, just rampant open-air drug use, drug markets. I witnessed this myself in San Francisco. The drug laws are on the books. The drug laws are in action, are current and present. It's just that district attorneys, politicians have said we're not going to enforce it. So vote them out. Promoting strong family and community ties, as I discussed before, with good health and well-being. If you do have that strong family structure, community structure, again, tight-knit religious communities especially, they have the lowest incidence of drug abuse and drug use there is. A lot of times people will get cast out of a community for abusing substances. That seems cruel, but I believe that the thinking behind that is keeping these people around that are bad influences can negatively influence young people coming up and other members of the community. And as unfriendly or cold as it may seem to cast someone out, it is for the protection of every member of the community. All right, the particular interest to me is the southern border. I do have some friends that work Border Patrol. I have spent some time down on the southern border in the medical aspect. As I said, drugs coming across, fentanyl, almost all of the fentanyl is coming from the Mexican border. Fentanyl there are 50 different derivatives of fentanyl. Now, when it's produced or when it's ordered, because it can simply be ordered off the dark web and mailed from China. That used to be the main way it got into the United States. It doesn't exactly have the greatest quality control. So if a drug dealer cuts his product, say heroin, with a certain amount of fentanyl that is exactly measured and appropriate for what he's looking for, it's not safe, but compared to what we're seeing today, yeah, it's relatively safe. However, when somebody fabricates or for whatever reason, by whatever means, receives a stronger derivative of fentanyl, that's when we see significant instances of overdose, and it tends to be what they call a hot shot, which is just way too much drug within what somebody considers a normal dose. A lot of the drugs that are in the streets these days are counterfeit drugs. I've even seen counterfeit Tylenol. I'm sure it wasn't marketed as Tylenol, but the pills were pressed and labeled to look like just simple over-the-counter Tylenol. But all of the party drugs, Xanax is one of the biggest ones that's counterfeited. It'll contain fentanyl for what people say is a better high, or from the dealer's perspective, a cheaper high. And you still run that risk of overdose for the reasons already discussed. Immigration, the immigration enforcement agents are completely overwhelmed. They are receiving help from other states, Florida, Texas, Arizona. They're pitching in to help federal immigration, but again, politics seems to have a lot of hands tied. All right, thank you for watching this presentation, and I hope this finds you well.